Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to, oops, where did we go here? Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to week one, module one. So this is our kind of first recording of the first lecture. So we'll get started. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is what a sociological perspective is. So sociology, some of you might have taken a sociology course before, but for others, this might be something that's new for you. So sociology is the scientific and systematic study of human behavior in a social context. So sociology would, when we're kind of going through this course, we're going to be taking like a sociological perspective. So this is a particular attitude toward or a way of regarding something, a point of view. So when we think about perspective, we recognize that our perspective is going to be influenced by our experiences and also what we know. So the things that we've learned in the past, things that have happened to us in our lives, things like that. So it also includes is the inclusion of circumstance. And so once you have, sometimes you might view something in a certain way, and then something happens and your perspective on that incident changes. So maybe I can give you even an example of an encounter with a friend. So say you're at school pre-COVID and you ask your friend like, hey, like how was like your weekend, or how are you doing? And like your friend just kind of blows you off, gives you the cold shoulder, kind of snubs you. You might have a perspective like, oh wow, that person's like really cranky, or like think like, oh, like maybe that person doesn't like me or something like that. And you might kind of take it personal. And then you might gain information. So maybe you find out that your friend, trying to think of an example. Maybe you found out that your friend is having car problems. So they just found out that their transmission blew on their car and it's going to cost like thousands of dollars for them to fix it, and they don't know what they're going to do. And that's why they kind of were short with you. So that might change your perspective on that person, right? So it includes the circumstances, it includes our experiences, it includes our learning, what knowledge we have. So our perspective is something that can always shift and change. So as you're going through this course, we might be looking at health issues that you're learning about some of your other classes, but we'll be taking on like a different perspective. So we might be looking at it from more a sociological perspective instead of that biomedical perspective that you'll be learning about in the nursing program. So hopefully that makes sense for people. So I have this photo here, and it's of a woman who has HIV. And so what I'd like you to think about, and this would be something that normally we would have a discussion around, but what are some of the stereotypes that surround like HIV? So like off the top of my head, some of the things that I've heard or some of the answers that have been brought up in the past are that people that are HIV positive are intravenous drug users, or they are sexually promiscuous, meaning that they have multiple sexual partners or things like that, right? So those are some of the things that might come to your head, but it's not an indiscriminatory disease. And so here it says, I was in a committed marriage, I wasn't dating. And so sometimes that context or that change in information can shift your perspective and change your perspective. I'm trying to think, this woman here shares her story. So I believe that she lives in Florida. And in the notes of this PowerPoint, you can go to the page and she talks about what happened and how she was found out that she was HIV positive. And her husband had not disclosed that he was also HIV positive to her. So you can go on and read that. Another question that I have are, the characteristics of homelessness. And when you can think of some of the things that potentially like might come to mind when you think of somebody that's homeless. And so some of those things might be somebody that is like, I'm suffering from addiction, or that has like mental health problems, or somebody that is very uneducated, or things like that. I will post, so I'm not going to show the video here, but I'm going to, under this module, I will embed the YouTube video of people that are homeless sharing their stories, and you'll see in that this really moving video. And there's people that are university educated, that had great jobs, that were athletes, that are parents, things like that. So really, sometimes it can shift your perspective once you gain more information on what someone's suffering with. So when it comes to addiction, which is the next thing we're going to talk about, addiction is by definition a condition that leads to a compulsive engagement with a stimuli despite negative consequences. So this can lead to physical or psychological dependence. So rates of addiction in Canada, so it's estimated that approximately 21% of the population, about 6 million people, will meet the criteria, for addiction in their lifetime. And that statistic comes from the Canadian Mental Health Association. So when we think about addiction, often we think about addiction as just an individual problem. So it's an individual problem. Sometimes we see it as an individual weakness. So that person just doesn't have enough self-control, or they're not able to, that it's a choice that they haven't been able to stop, things like that. So we're going to look at the addiction from a sociological perspective. So the social view of addiction, and specifically on opioid addiction. So as our nations are just struck with the level of opioid addiction, we must recognize kind of the history behind it or the reasons for it. And often addiction is a way, especially opioid addiction, is a way to soothe emotional pain. So the first question when dealing with opioid dependent human beings should not be why the addiction, but why the pain. And so kind of shifting our perspective to understanding kind of the history of that individual and what's going on and why. And so in this article that I have posted here from CBC, it talks about how it's not a fault, it's not a moral lapse, it's not a sin, it's not a failure of will, nor yet even an inherited disease, but a complex response to suffering. It is not a legal problem, but a human problem to which the solutions need to be humane in every single way, or so every way possible. So I don't know if I can pull up this article here, if it will still record. Yeah. So this is an article by a physician who shares his views on the fentanyl crisis in BC. And so I'll invite you to read through that article, but it's looking at how opioid users opioid users are often using opioids because of some sort of emotional trauma that they've experienced. And they have done studies specifically in the downtown east side of Vancouver, where many of the women that are suffering from opioid addictions are also working in the sex trade and have experienced abuse growing up, many of that being sexual abuse. And the men in the study often had experienced some sort of physical abuse or neglect. And so this is where it goes on. It talks about how child adversity shapes the brain and how childhood trauma shapes the I can't talk today. Sorry, of the developing brain in ways that induce susceptibility to addiction. So hence, the addiction-prone person finds relief in substances that would not entice others, even after repeated exposure to the same drug. So that prolonged drug use changes the brain and entrenches the addictive drive. So it goes on to talk about multi-generational trauma in First Nations communities and how that has shaped addiction and changing the way we view addiction. So changing it from not this moral lapse or sin or failure, things like that, but recognizing that it's a human problem, and we need to include humane treatments for people that are suffering from addiction. Okay, so I'll let you read through the rest of that article on your own. Oh no, here we go. Okay, so back to my slides. So when we look at the sociological perspective, we recognize that there are many components to it, or many things that we would analyze. So the first thing that we would look at is culture. So when we're looking at human behavior, we're looking at different biomedical issues. We recognize the importance that culture takes in in how we view, how we treat, how we study, that type of thing. So when, even for something as simple as, or not, sorry, not simple, but even for topics like mental health, in some cultures, there isn't even a term for mental health, right? So you might see when you're looking, I teach a lot of psychology courses. So when we're looking at different rates of psychological or psychological disorders or mental illnesses across cultures, some cultures, like you would see like rates of, they don't have it in their culture, but that might not necessarily be because no one suffers from it, but because they don't even have a term for it, or it's something that they don't recognize. So when we look at when we take on a sociological perspective, we always have to examine the role of culture. We also look at social context. So social context plays like a very large role. And so how you behave in one social context might be something totally different than how you're going to behave in another one. So even when you think about coming to our live classes over Microsoft Teams, how you present yourself in that situation is going to be totally different than how you would present yourself if you're having like a Zoom meeting with your friends on a Friday night, right? Or it's kind of funny that I'm using these examples, but how you act in one social context is going to be something is totally different. And we're also going to look at the different roles and the different like micro versus global contexts, and how things can shift and change and where they fall into that. Social institutions, the sociological perspective would look at the role of social institutions. So we're all part of social institutions in our society. So education is one social institution, but a family would be recognized as another social institution. You would see medical hospitals are social institutions, and the government is a social institution, and things like that. Society and personal life. So the sociological perspective would incorporate the society in which the behavior that they're studying, or the illness that they're studying. They would also look at the individual's personal life, and then also the role of social organization. So we're going to go through each one of those like in more detail in the next module. So that's it for module 1.